The morning sun hadn't fully cleared the skyline yet when he walked into JFK's Terminal 4, rolling a small black carry-on behind him. He wore dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a soft gray hoodie, nothing flashy, nothing branded. No gold chains, no designer sunglasses, no entourage. Just a young black man in his early 20s, moving with the kind of quiet calm that comes from knowing exactly who you are and not needing anyone else to confirm it. He'd flown commercial plenty of times before. Even after his net worth crossed into the billions, private jets were efficient, sure, but they felt isolating. On a regular flight, he could disappear. No one expected anything from him. No handshakes, no pitches, no awkward, "I loved your TED Talk" comments. Just a few hours of anonymity at 35,000 feet. For this short hop to London, he'd booked an economy plus window seat, extra legroom, a little more peace, and still far enough from first class to avoid the spotlight. He checked his boarding pass one last time. Seat 14A, window, aisle on the left. He liked window seats. They gave him space to think, to watch clouds roll by, to let his mind wander without interruption. As he approached row 14, he saw it right away. The seat was taken. A man in his late 50s sat there leaning back like he owned the place. He wore a wrinkled navy blazer over a polo shirt, reading a paperback with one hand while the other held a paper coffee cup from the terminal cafe. His carry-on was shoved under the seat in front of him, and his feet, still in loafers, stuck out just enough to brush the aisle. He didn't look up as the young man stopped beside him. "Excuse me," the young man said, voice low but clear. "I think you're in my seat." The man glanced up, squinting slightly as if trying to place him. Then he looked at the boarding pass the young man held out. He didn't take it, didn't really read it. Just gave a half nod and said, "I've been sitting here for 10 minutes. Gate agent said it was open." That wasn't true. The gate had been clearly called and the overhead bins were nearly full, but the young man didn't argue. He'd been here before, not in this exact situation, but close enough. The kind of moment where your words are heard but not believed, where your presence is questioned before your proof is even considered. He stepped back slightly, giving the man space but didn't move on. A flight attendant passing by noticed the standoff and slowed, offering a tight, practiced smile. "Everything okay here?" "He says this is his seat," the man in the blazer said, as if that were absurd. The young man held up his boarding pass again, this time angling it toward the attendant. 14A window. The attendant glanced at it, then at the seat number above the row. "Oh, yeah, that is 14A. She turned to the man. "Sir, would you mind checking your boarding pass again? Sometimes the scanners assign seats differently." The man sighed, pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, then frowned. "Huh, it says 14C. He sounded surprised, almost disappointed, like the system had betrayed him. But instead of getting up right away, he took another slow sip of coffee as if buying time. "I didn't see any labels," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. There were labels. Big, bold letters on the overhead bin and the armrest. Economy Plus, 14A. But pointing that out felt like inviting a debate he didn't want to have. Not here, not now. Not with dozens of tired travelers watching, some already pulling out phones. The young man gave a small nod. "No worries. I'll figure it out." And with that, he turned and walked toward the back of the plane. He didn't go to another seat. He didn't complain to another crew member. Instead, he found a quiet corner near the rear galley, where the noise of boarding had died down. He pulled out his phone, unlocked it with his thumb, and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. It rang twice. "Hey," came a voice on the other end. Calm, familiar, no surprise. "Hey, it's me. At JFK, flight 217 to London." A pause. "You okay?" "Yeah, just minor issue. Seat 14A's taken. Guy won't move. Staff aren't stepping in." Another pause. Longer this time. "You want me to call the airline?" "No, but I need to know if I walk off this plane, what happens?" The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "If you walk, they'll delay departure. Probably ground it. They can't risk losing you as a customer. Not after last quarter's investor meeting," he exhaled. "I don't want drama, but I'm not sitting in 14B or 14C, and I'm not arguing with someone who thinks my seat is up for grabs just because I look like I shouldn't be here." "I get it," the voice said. "Do what you need to do. I'll alert corporate security. Quietly. Thanks." He ended the call and stood there for a moment, watching passengers settle in, flight attendants doing final checks, the hum of the aircraft systems coming alive. He wasn't angry. Not really. More tired. Tired of having to prove he belonged. In boardrooms, in airports, in spaces that money should have made neutral but never quite were. He walked back toward the front of the cabin. The man in 14A was still there, now scrolling through his phone, looking perfectly at ease. The young man stopped a few rows away and waited. Within 3 minutes, 2 people in dark uniforms, badges clipped to their belts, earpieces in place, boarded the plane from the jet bridge. They moved quickly, speaking in low tones to the lead flight attendant. Passengers noticed. Heads turned. Whispers started. One of the supervisors approached the man in 14A. "Sir, could I see your boarding pass, please?" The man handed it over without protest. The supervisor scanned it, then looked at the seat. "This is 14A. Your assignment is 14C, middle seat, 2 rows back." "But I was told..." "Regardless," the supervisor cut in gently but firmly. "This seat is assigned to another passenger who has already boarded. We need you to move immediately for safety and compliance reasons." The man blinked. For the first time, he looked uncertain. He glanced around as if searching for backup, but found none. The flight attendant stood nearby, arms crossed, neutral but resolute. Passengers watched in silence. "Fine," he muttered, gathering his book and coffee. He stood slowly, shoulders stiff, and shuffled down the aisle to 16C, a standard economy seat, no extra legroom, wedged between 2 strangers. The young man didn't say thank you. Didn't smirk. He simply walked to 14A, slid his carry-on under the seat, and sat down. He buckled his seatbelt, pulled out a notebook, and began writing. Notes for a meeting he'd have in London. Ideas for a new education initiative his foundation was launching. Outside, the plane began to taxi. The engines roared softly. People leaned back, adjusted headphones, closed their eyes. Normal flight stuff. Then, just as they reached the runway threshold, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been asked to return to the gate for an operational review. We apologize for the inconvenience. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." A collective groan rose through the cabin. Someone muttered, "Seriously?" Another passenger opened their laptop, already drafting a complaint email, but the young man didn't react. He kept writing, because he knew this wasn't about inconvenience. It was about correction, about sending a message that some things shouldn't be negotiable. Fairness, respect, the simple right to occupy the space you paid for without having to justify your existence. As the plane turned back toward the terminal, sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the cabin. He looked out, watching the tarmac crew wave them in, and thought about how strange it was that in a world full of technology, wealth, and speed, the hardest thing to change was still how people saw each other. He closed his notebook, took a breath, and waited. Not for applause, not for recognition, just for the next right thing to happen. And somewhere deep in the airline's operations center, phones were already ringing. Meetings were being called. Policies were being reviewed. Because one quiet call from one quiet young man had done what protests and petitions sometimes couldn't. It made a system pause, look in the mirror, and ask, how did we let this happen? The flight would be delayed. Passengers would grumble. But maybe, just maybe, next time, someone else wouldn't have to prove they belonged. And that was worth a little extra time on the ground. The plane rolled slowly back to the gate, its engines winding down with a low sigh. Inside, the mood shifted from restless anticipation to full-blown frustration. A woman in 12B sighed loudly and texted someone with furious thumbs. A man across the aisle pulled out his earbuds and asked no one in particular, "What even is an operational review?" The flight attendants moved calmly through the cabin, offering bottled water and tight-lipped reassurances, but their eyes betrayed the same confusion everyone else felt. Something unusual was happening, something they weren't being told about. In seat 14A, the young man stayed quiet. He didn't check his phone, didn't lean forward to eavesdrop on speculation. He simply sat, hands folded in his lap, watching the ground crew approach with their headsets and clipboards. He knew what was coming, not because he demanded it, but because systems, when nudged by the right kind of pressure, tend to correct themselves quickly. Especially when that pressure comes from a place that quietly owns pieces of the machine. Back in the airline's operations center, A sleek, windowless room deep inside JFK's corporate wing. Things were moving fast. A senior vice president of customer experience stood in front of a large digital screen showing Flight 217's manifest, her brow furrowed. Beside her, the head of corporate security paced with a phone pressed to his ear. On speaker, a calm voice from legal counsel laid out the facts. The passenger in question is not just a high-net-worth individual. His investment group holds indirect stakes in 2 of our major fuel suppliers and has advisory influence with the private equity firm that owns 18% of our parent company. This isn't about one seat. It's about perceived systemic bias and how it reflects on our brand during a quarter where we're already under fire for service complaints. No one said the word race out loud. They didn't have to. It hung in the air like humidity, felt by everyone, named by no one. But the truth was clear. If a white passenger had been sitting in the wrong seat and a black man had politely asked him to move, would the outcome have been the same? Would the gate agent have hesitated? Would the flight attendant have deferred? The airline had run internal audits on this exact scenario before. The data wasn't flattering. Meanwhile, on the plane, the man who'd been moved to 16C kept glancing toward the front. He looked less angry now and more unsettled. He'd replayed the moment in his head a dozen times. Had he really not seen the seat number? Or had he just assumed, without thinking, that the young man must have made a mistake? That kind of assumption wasn't malicious, not exactly. But it was familiar, and that's what made it dangerous. It wasn't the loud, obvious kind of prejudice. It was the quiet kind, the kind that lets someone take up space that isn't theirs because they've never been asked to question whether they deserve it. A flight attendant paused by his row. "Everything all right, sir?" He nodded quickly. "Yeah, just weird day." She gave a small smile. "Tell me about it." Back at the gate, 2 new supervisors boarded, not the same ones from before, but higher up. They carried tablets and moved with purpose. One went straight to the lead flight attendant. The other walked down the aisle, scanning seat numbers, making eye contact with passengers as if silently apologizing for the disruption. When he reached 14A, he stopped. "Sir," he said softly, crouching slightly to speak at eye level, "we sincerely apologize for what happened earlier. That should never have occurred. We're conducting a full review of our boarding verification process, effective immediately." The young man looked up. No anger in his eyes. No satisfaction either. Just quiet acknowledgement. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I'm not the one who needs protecting. It's the next person who looks like me and doesn't have a phone number that gets calls returned in under a minute." The supervisor hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." Outside, a new ground team arrived. Not just ramp agents, but members of the airline's internal compliance unit. They began speaking with the original gate agents, reviewing boarding logs, checking camera footage from the jet bridge. This wasn't standard procedure for a seating mix-up. But then this wasn't a mix-up. It was a signal. Inside the terminal, passengers who'd deplaned for other flights started noticing the commotion. A few pulled out phones. One posted a short video. "Flight to London just got turned around after takeoff. Rumor is some rich guy got his seat stolen and made them stop the plane." The caption was exaggerated, but the core was true enough to spread. Within 20 minutes, the post had hundreds of likes. Comments flew. Entitled Billionaire, good for him, why should he move? This is why flying sucks now. Bet they wouldn't do this if he was white. The internet, as always, turned nuance into noise. But none of that reached the young man. He'd powered off his phone the moment he sat down. He wasn't here for the drama. He was here because he'd learned long ago that silence only works when you have the power to be heard anyway, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept the default. An hour passed. The cabin grew warmer. Flight attendants handed out snack boxes, complimentary as a goodwill gesture. Kids colored in activity sheets. A couple argued in hushed tones about missed connections. Life went on, even in limbo. Then a new voice came over the intercom. Calmer, more deliberate than the captain's earlier announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've completed our operational review and are preparing to reboard for departure. We deeply regret the delay and appreciate your understanding. As a token of our apology, all passengers on this flight will receive a full refund of their ticket, plus a travel voucher for future use." A murmur of surprise rippled through the cabin. Full refund? On an international flight. That didn't happen unless something serious had gone wrong, or someone important had been wronged. In 16C, the man stared at his hands. He thought about the young man in 14A, how he hadn't yelled, hadn't made a scene, hadn't even seemed upset. Just firm, certain. And that certainty had moved an entire airline. It unsettled him, not because he felt attacked, but because he realized how rarely he'd questioned his own assumptions, how often he'd taken up space without thinking twice. When the plane finally pushed back from the gate again, the atmosphere was different, quieter, more respectful. People kept to themselves. Even the flight attendants moved with extra care, double-checking seat assignments as they walked the aisles. As they taxied toward the runway once more, the young man looked out the window. The sun was higher now, glinting off the wings. He thought about the call he'd made, not to flex power, but to test a system. And the system had bent. Not because he was rich, but because he'd forced it to see its own blind spot. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired, because he knew this wasn't a victory. It was maintenance, like patching a leak in a roof you didn't build but still have to live under. Every time someone like him had to say, "This is mine," it wasn't just about a seat. It was about belonging, about being believed without having to prove it 10 different ways. The engines roared as the plane lifted off. Passengers leaned back, exhaling in unison. The man in 16C closed his eyes. The young man in 14A opened his notebook again, but this time he didn't write about business. He wrote a note to his foundations team. Look into airline staff training programs. Focus on implicit bias and customer verification. Fund a pilot, anonymous, no branding. Make it mandatory for all major carriers we partner with. Because real change didn't happen in headlines. It happened in checklists, in protocols, in the quiet moments when a gate agent double-checks a boarding pass not because they're afraid of losing a billionaire, but because it's simply the right thing to do. As the plane climbed into the clouds, New York shrank below, a patchwork of streets and lights, full of people trying to get where they needed to go. Some would never question their right to be there. Others would spend their whole lives proving it. He closed the notebook, tucked it away, and watched the horizon. The flight would land in 6 hours. And by then, maybe, just maybe, one small crack in the system would have started to heal. Not because of him, but because of what his presence had revealed, and that was enough. By the time the plane touched down at Heathrow, the story had already begun to slip out of its container. Not from the young man. He'd kept his phone off the entire flight, slept for a few hours, and walked through immigration with the same quiet anonymity he'd boarded with. But someone in 12F had recorded a 30-second clip during the delay, a blurred shot of the man in the blazer being asked to move, the supervisors in dark uniforms, the murmurs from other passengers. They'd posted it with a vague caption, "Flight grounded after seat dispute." Guy in hoodie didn't say much, but the airline panicked. It wasn't accurate, but it was compelling. And in the age of outrage and admiration, compelling was enough. Within hours, the clip had been shared across forums, reposted by travel bloggers, dissected on morning news segments overseas. Headlines varied. Billionaire grounds flight over stolen seat. Airline backs down after racial tension on board. Privilege or principle. The JFK seat incident explained. Most stories didn't name him, they didn't need to. His face was recognizable enough to those who followed tech or finance, but vague enough to the general public that speculation ran wild. Was he an heir? A crypto founder? A music producer? No one got it quite right, but everyone had an opinion. What no one saw was what happened after he landed. He didn't go to a luxury hotel, didn't call a press team. Instead, he took the tube from Heathrow into central London, just like any other traveler with a backpack and a plan. He checked into a modest boutique hotel near Covent Garden. No suite, no concierge fuss, and spent the evening reviewing documents for a meeting the next morning. A partnership with a UK-based nonprofit focused on digital literacy in underserved schools. But even there, the ripple reached him. Around 9 p.m., his phone buzzed. A message from his head of communications. Media's connecting the dots. They know it was you. Do you want to respond? He typed back no statement. No interviews. Let it fade. He knew how these things worked. If he spoke, it became a performance. If he stayed silent, it remained a moment, small, human, and real. And that's what he wanted it to be. Not a spectacle, but a signal. Meanwhile, back in the US, the airline was scrambling. Their social media team had issued a vague apology. "We regret any discomfort experienced by our passengers," but it only fueled more criticism. Advocacy groups pointed to the incident as proof of systemic bias in air travel. Industry analysts noted the refund and voucher move was unprecedented for a non-mechanical delay. And quietly, behind closed doors, the airline's leadership held an emergency strategy session. They weren't angry. They were embarrassed. Because the truth was, they'd known this could happen. Their own internal surveys showed that Black and brown passengers were 30% more likely to have their boarding passes double-checked, 40% more likely to be questioned about seat assignments, and nearly twice as likely to be moved without explanation, even when they were in the right seat. They'd filed those reports. They'd promised further review, but nothing had changed. Until now. What made this different wasn't the passenger's wealth. It was his restraint. He hadn't shouted, hadn't filmed, hadn't demanded the man be removed from the flight. He'd simply said, "This is mine," and let the system reveal its own flaw by how hard it scrambled to fix it. 2 days after the flight, the airline announced a new initiative, Verified Seating Protocol. Starting immediately, all gate agents and cabin crew would be required to visually confirm seat assignments in premium economy and above before departure. No more assumptions. No more "I thought it was open." Just clear, consistent verification, applied equally to every passenger, regardless of how they looked or what they wore. They didn't mention the incident. Didn't credit anyone, but insiders knew. Around the same time, a reporter tracked down the man who'd taken the seat. He agreed to speak, off the record at first, then on background, and finally with his face blurred on camera. He sat in his living room, hands clasped, voice low. "I didn't think I was doing anything wrong," he said. "I saw an empty seat, sat down. When he showed me his pass, I guess part of me just didn't believe it. Not because I'm racist. I don't think I am. But because I've never been told I was in the wrong seat before. Never had to prove I belonged. So when someone who looked like he might not fit in that row said it was his, I hesitated. And that hesitation cost everyone time. That's on me." His honesty surprised people. It wasn't a perfect apology, it was human. Flawed, reflective, and real. Comments poured in. "Thank you for saying this. We've all been that guy without realizing it. This is how change starts." Back in London, the young man read the interview over breakfast. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt seen, not as a billionaire, not as a symbol, but as a person who'd simply wanted to sit where he'd paid to sit, and had been doubted because of how he looked. That afternoon, he met with the nonprofit team. They talked about curriculum, teacher training, internet access in rural communities, but halfway through he paused. "Have you ever thought about expanding into workplace bias training?" he asked. The director blinked. "Not really. We focus on youth," he nodded. "What if we built a module for service industries? Airports, hotels, retail, places where people are judged in seconds. Not with lectures. With real scenarios, role-playing, feedback loops." The room went quiet. Then one of the younger staff members leaned forward. "You mean, like what happened on your flight?" He didn't confirm or deny, just said, "People don't need more rules. They need better reflexes." By the end of the meeting, they'd sketched out a pilot program, funded entirely by his foundation. No logo, no press release, just a quiet investment in changing how people see each other before they even speak. A week later, he flew back to the US, again on a commercial flight, again in Economy Plus. Same airline, different route. As he walked down the jet bridge, the gate agent checked his boarding pass, looked at the seat map on her tablet and said, 14A, window. "All set," he nodded. "Thanks." Inside the cabin, everything felt smoother. The flight attendants made direct eye contact. Seat assignments were verified row by row. No one assumed. No one hesitated. He sat down, buckled up, and watched the tarmac fade below. No drama, no delay. Just a flight doing what it was supposed to do. Later, in a boardroom thousands of miles away, an airline executive would say in a meeting, "We lost $220,000 on that grounded flight. Refunds, fuel, crew overtime. But we gained something harder to measure: trust. From a group of customers we've been failing for years without even knowing it. And in a small office in East London, a team of educators began writing scripts for a training video. The first scene: a young man in a hoodie shows his boarding pass. A passenger in a blazer refuses to move. The screen freezes. A question appears. What do you do? No right answer is given immediately. Because the point isn't to punish. It's to pause, to notice, to choose differently next time. The young man never saw that video. He didn't need to. He'd already lived it. And in the end, that was the real story. Not the grounded flight, not the viral clip, not even the billionaire part. It was the quiet moment when someone said, "This is mine," and the world for once believed him without asking for proof. That moment didn't change everything, but it changed enough, and sometimes enough is how real progress begins, not with a bang but with a seat, a pass, and the courage to stand your ground without raising your voice. The story should have ended there. It had all the pieces of a clean arc: tension, resolution, a quiet lesson learned. The flight landed. The airline changed its policy. The man who took the seat reflected. The young man moved on. But real life doesn't wrap up neatly. It echoes. A month after the incident, a video surfaced, not from a passenger, but from a flight attendant who'd been working that day. She didn't show faces. She didn't name names. But she described what happened in calm, steady detail. How the gate agent hesitated, how the crew stayed silent at first, how everything shifted only after a call was made. She ended with a simple question. Why did it take someone powerful for us to do what we should have done from the start? The video went modestly viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Other flight attendants, gate agents, even baggage handlers began sharing their own stories in the comments. Not about that flight, but about the pattern. The white passenger who yells and gets upgraded. The black family asked to verify their first-class tickets 3 times. The woman in a hijab pulled aside for random screening every single trip. These weren't isolated incidents. They were routines, so normal they'd stopped feeling wrong. The airline, still sensitive from the earlier fallout, responded quickly. They invited the flight attendant, who remained anonymous, to join a new internal task force on equity and customer service. Not as a token, but as a co-lead. And quietly they reached out to the young man's foundation, not for money, but for partnership. He didn't reply right away. He'd been burned before by companies wanting to collaborate, just to clean up their image. But this felt different. They weren't asking for a donation with their logo on it. They were asking for help building something that might actually last, so he said yes, but with conditions. No press, no branding, no photos of him shaking hands with executives. Just work. The first meeting happened over Zoom, late at night his time, early morning theirs. On the call were airline trainers, frontline staff, HR reps, and 2 members of his foundation's education team. No titles were used. Just first names or no names at all. What do you want this to fix? One of the trainers asked. Not fix, the young man said. Prevent. He explained that policies like verify every seat were good, but they only addressed the symptom. The real issue lived in the split-second decisions people made before policy even kicked in. The glance, the pause, the assumption that someone didn't belong. That's where bias lived, not in malice, but in autopilot. So they designed a training module unlike any the airline had used before. No PowerPoint slides with bullet points. No robotic role plays where everyone knew the right answer. Instead, they built immersive scenarios using real audio from actual flights. Voices altered, details changed. Trainees would hear a boarding announcement, then a passenger dispute, then have to respond in real time, without knowing who was right. One scenario. A man in a hoodie says his seat is 14A. A passenger in a blazer says he was told it was open. What do you do? Another. A woman with natural hair and gold hoops is asked by another passenger if she's sure she's in first class. How do you intervene? The goal wasn't to shame. It was to build muscle memory for fairness so that when the moment came, the response wasn't hesitation but action. Pilots, surprisingly, were among the most engaged. We're trained to override instinct in emergencies, one said. Why not in human interactions? Meanwhile, the man who'd taken the seat kept thinking about that flight. He hadn't flown since. Not out of guilt, but because he didn't trust himself not to do it again, automatically without thinking. He started reading. Articles about implicit bias, books about microaggressions. He even attended a community workshop at a local library, sitting in the back, listening more than speaking. One evening, he wrote a letter, not to the young man, he didn't know how to reach him, but to the airline. In it, he admitted his assumption, described his discomfort, and suggested they include passengers in their training somehow. Because bias isn't just on your staff, he wrote. It's in all of us, and we're part of the environment too. The airline didn't publish the letter, but they shared it internally. And they took his idea seriously. In the next version of the training, they added a short video shown during boarding on seatback screens. A calm voice saying, "Please respect your fellow passengers' space and assignments. If you're unsure of your seat, ask a crew member. Don't assume." Simple, neutral, human. Back in the US, the young man visited a high school in Atlanta. He wasn't there as a billionaire. He was there as a guest speaker for a coding club his foundation supported. The kids didn't care about his net worth. They cared that he'd built an app at 16 that helped his little sister with dyslexia. They asked about bugs, servers, late nights debugging code, normal stuff. Afterward, a teacher pulled him aside. "One of our students saw the video about the flight," she said softly. "He told me if he can stand his ground like that, maybe I can too." The young man didn't know what to say. He hadn't thought of himself as an example. He'd just been tired of explaining, tired of proving, tired of being treated like a mistake. But if his quiet insistence gave someone else permission to exist fully in their space, then maybe the discomfort had been worth it. A few weeks later, the airline rolled out the new training to all customer-facing staff at JFK. Not as punishment, but as professional development. Completion was mandatory, but the tone was supportive. This isn't about blame. It's about getting better, for everyone. Early feedback was promising. One gate agent wrote, "I caught myself almost making an assumption last week. I paused, checked the pass. It was correct, but I almost didn't. That's why this matters." The young man read that note and felt something shift inside him. Not pride, but relief. Because change wasn't happening because of him. It was happening around him, through people choosing to do better even when no one was watching. He still flew commercial, still chose window seats. But now, when he walked down the aisle, he noticed small things. A flight attendant making sure seat numbers matched before letting someone sit. A passenger double-checking their own assignment before stowing their bag. A child pointing to the overhead label and saying, "That's ours, Mom." These weren't grand gestures. They were tiny corrections in a system that had been off balance for generations. But together they added up. And the best part? No one made a show of it. There were no headlines, no viral moments, just people doing their jobs with a little more care, a little more awareness. That, he realized, was the real win. Not the grounded flight, not the apology, but the quiet, everyday moments where fairness became the default, not the exception. He boarded another flight soon after, same airline, same terminal. As he settled into his seat, the flight attendant paused by his row. "Welcome back," she said with a small, genuine smile. He nodded. "Thanks, no mention of the past. No awkwardness. Just recognition, human to human." The plane pushed back on time. No delays, no drama, just a smooth departure into a clear sky. And as the wheels left the ground, he finally felt what he'd been missing all along. Not power, not victory, but peace. The kind that comes when you don't have to fight just to be seen. The kind that says, "You belong here." And this time, he didn't have to prove it, because the world slowly was starting to believe it too. Months had passed since that flight. Seasons had shifted. The story that once buzzed in headlines and comment sections had faded into the background hum of internet memory, mentioned occasionally in discussions about travel equity, cited in a few university case studies, but no longer trending, no longer urgent, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He wasn't chasing legacy. He wasn't trying to become a symbol. He just wanted to sit in his seat without having to explain why he deserved to be there. Now, on a cool October morning, he stood in a nearly empty terminal at O'Hare, waiting for a flight to Seattle. Same routine, small carry-on, hoodie, no fanfare. He'd been in Chicago for a quiet meeting with educators building tech labs in rural schools. Another project his foundation supported. Another step toward leveling a playing field he'd once had to climb alone. As he approached his gate, he noticed something different. Not dramatic, not flashy, just consistent. The gate agent looked up as he neared, checked his boarding pass against the screen and said, 15A, window, economy plus, boarding group 3. You're all set, no double take, no hesitation. Just a simple confirmation, delivered the same way she'd spoken to the passenger before him, a woman in a business suit, and the one after, a teenager with headphones and a skateboard. He nodded and moved to the waiting area. Around him, people scrolled on phones, sipped coffee, chatted with travel companions. Normal pre-flight energy. No tension. No assumptions hanging in the air like static. When his group was called, he walked down the jet bridge without a second thought. Inside the cabin, the flight attendants greeted passengers with calm efficiency. One glanced at his seat number as he passed and gave a small professional nod. He slid into 15A, stowed his bag, and buckled in. The seat next to him stayed empty, a rare bit of luck on a full flight. As the plane prepared for departure, he watched the ground crew through the window. The choreography was familiar. Hoses disconnected, stairs pulled away, final signals exchanged. Everything ran smoothly, no delays, no last-minute returns to the gate, just the quiet hum of a system working as it should. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to breathe, to feel the absence of something he hadn't realized weighed so heavily. The constant low-grade vigilance of having to prove you belong. That was the real cost of moments. Like the one in JFK, not the inconvenience, not even the embarrassment, but the exhaustion of always being ready to defend your place in the world. And now, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel that weight. The plane lifted off cleanly, climbing through layers of cloud until the sky turned a deep, endless blue. He pulled out a notebook, not for business this time, but for reflection. He'd been thinking a lot lately about impact. Not the kind measured in headlines or net worth, but in quiet shifts. A gate agent who checks every pass, a passenger who questions their own assumption, a training module that changes how someone sees the world. He wrote, "Real change doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the details no one films." Back in London, the nonprofit he'd partnered with had just completed the first round of their bias awareness training with airport staff across 3 major hubs. Early results were promising, not because people suddenly became woke, but because they'd been given tools to catch themselves before acting on autopilot. One participant wrote in feedback, "I used to think I was neutral. Now I know neutrality isn't enough. You have to choose fairness actively." Meanwhile, the airline had expanded the verified seating protocol to all international flights. They'd even begun sharing their framework, anonymous, no branding, with other carriers through an industry coalition. It wasn't perfect. Mistakes still happened. But the culture was shifting, slowly, steadily, and the man who'd taken the seat. He'd flown again just last week. This time, when he saw someone looking confused near their row, he stepped in. "Need help finding your seat?" he'd asked gently. The traveler, an older woman with a cane, smiled gratefully. He walked her to her row, confirmed the number with a flight attendant, and went to his own seat without fanfare. It wasn't redemption. It was repair, small, human, and ongoing. The young man smiled faintly as he wrote that down too. Not as a victory, but as proof that people can change when given the chance, and the awareness. Hours passed. The cabin lights dimmed. Meals were served and cleared. Passengers dozed or watched movies. He stayed awake, watching the landscape unfold below. Patchwork fields, winding rivers, clusters of lights marking towns he'd never visit. There was peace in the anonymity of it all. No one knew who he was. No one expected anything. He was just another traveler, headed somewhere, minding his own business. And that, more than any headline or refund or policy change, felt like progress. When the plane began its descent into Seattle, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Calm, routine, unremarkable. "We're starting our approach. Weather is clear. Should be a smooth landing. No drama, no delays, no grounding. Just a flight doing what it was meant to do." As the wheels touched down and the cabin filled with the soft applause some passengers always give, a habit he never understood but found oddly endearing. He felt a quiet sense of closure, not because the issue of bias had been solved, far from it, but because this one small corner of the world had adjusted its lens, just enough to see people clearly. He gathered his things and joined the line to deplane. At the jet bridge, a ground staff member held the door open with a polite, "Have a great day." He returned the courtesy with a simple, "Thanks, you too." Outside, the Pacific Northwest air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and pine. He hailed a rideshare, gave the address of a modest hotel near the University District, and settled into the back seat. The driver, a woman with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor, asked if he wanted the radio on. He said no, and they rode in comfortable silence. Later that evening, he met with a group of students, computer science undergrads working on accessibility apps for people with visual impairments. They didn't know his net worth. They knew him as someone who'd funded their lab and occasionally showed up to ask thoughtful questions. Over pizza and soda, they debated code structure, user testing, ethical design. He listened more than he spoke, laughed at their inside jokes, felt for a few hours like just another person who cared about making things better. Before leaving, one of the students asked, "Do you ever get tired of trying to fix everything?" He thought for a moment. "I'm not trying to fix everything," he said. "Just the parts I can reach," and that was the truth. He couldn't dismantle every system, couldn't change every mind, but he could show up, speak up, use what he had, not for attention but for adjustment. Back at the hotel, he opened his laptop and checked an email from his foundation team. The bias training pilot had been approved for national rollout in partnership with 3 major airlines. They'd kept it clean. No logos, no press, just curriculum and support. Teachers, retail workers, and hotel staff would be next. He typed a quick reply. "Good work. Keep it human." Then he closed the laptop, turned off the lights, and stood by the window. Seattle glittered below, a city of bridges and hills and hidden stories. Somewhere out there, someone was boarding a flight, sitting in their assigned seat, not having to prove a thing. He smiled, because the real victory wasn't in the moment the plane turned back. It was in all the flights that took off smoothly afterward, carrying people who finally, quietly got to just be. No explanations. No performances. No doubt, just a seat, a ticket, and the unspoken understanding that everyone belongs where they've paid to be. And as he turned away from the window, ready for sleep, he carried none of the weight he once did, because the world, in its slow, imperfect way, was learning to make space, not because he demanded it, but because he simply refused to move.